Hey everyone, thank you for watching today's video. Yes, I have a haircut that just took place right now, but you're about to watch me in a few seconds without a haircut because I shot this in reverse. Anyways, that doesn't matter. What does matter is today's video is sponsored and brought to you by G Fuel. You guys know G Fuel. G Fuel, of course, is the energy supplement alternative out there. For those of you guys trying to cut back on things like soda, sugar drinks, like juices and whatnot, G Fuel is a great alternative to that. Now, I, of course, love this stuff. I was one of those skeptics at first, but now I really love it. I love working with them, and you guys actually love buying this stuff. We've been working with them for so many years that we've been alluding to hashtag fists on cups for a while, which is basically me being like, hey, let's get my logo on a cup. And I'm not gonna spoil it for you, but that might be happening. So that is awesome. And one day, we will get a flavor, a completionist flavor. That would be so sick. In the meantime though, you can get 30% off any of your current orders right now at gfuel.com if you use code completionist on checkout. Personally speaking, I always say it, the Fazeberry one's my favorite because it's that nice balance between sour and sweet. The sour Fazeberry version. I also really like that they do a lot of promotions with certain movie brands, and those ones are always really good. The Spider-Man one was great. I love the Venom one. The Crash Bandicoot one was really tasty. So yeah, they've got a whole bunch of flavors, a whole bunch of different content creators too they work with. So if you perhaps like other people who do stuff like me, you can try their flavors out too. Shout outs to A-Drive. I love that shiny blue lemonade. It's so good. Again, gfuel.com, use code completionist on checkout for 30% off. You guys are awesome and enjoy today's video. Bye-bye. No, not bye-bye. See you soon. See you real soon.
My Banjo Kazooie hype has never honestly gone away since I played the original Banjo Kazooie all the way back in 1998. That game sparked a love in me for 3D platformers that still continues to this day. It is a part of my online DNA. Hell, that clip of me freaking out to Banjo being in Smash went viral because I was just so happy. So it might shock some of you to learn that the first time I played Banjo Tooie was actually on the Xbox Live Arcade for my show. I liked it, but Banjo Tooie didn't exactly blow my mind the first time I completed that game. But now that 2022 is shaping up to be the golden age of sequel games, I thought it might be time to finally update my own thoughts about Banjo Tooie.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Completionist New Game Plus, the show where I am recompleting the first 120 games I ever featured here on the channel. You know what's hot right now? Sequels. You know what's less hot but still comes up in conversation because I keep talking about it? Banjo Kazooie! So today is the perfect opportunity to talk about Banjo Tooie, the sequel to one of my favorite games of all time that I somehow skipped over when it first released when I was a kid. Revisiting it last year was a surprisingly good time and helped me appreciate it a lot more. I think it's awesome that the Banjo hype has not really died these last few decades. A few decades later, these characters have a huge legacy. The Banjo in Smash announcement has had me fired up for years and made recompleting Banjo Tooie a much more memorable experience. So, put a bird in your damn backpack and let's get to getting some jiggies.
And the battle continues! This could turn it all around! This bout will determine who is the strongest once and for all!
Maybe it's all about the twos for me in 2022, but it feels like this year there are an unprecedented amount of highly anticipated sequels and spiritual successors for lots of franchises. Horizon Forbidden West just came out. You could argue that Elden Ring is the next evolution of the Souls games. And I'm still hoping to see God of War Ragnarok and the next Breath of the Wild by the end of this year. Probably not though. I'm always looking forward to seeing the next step in video games, and sequels provide developers a chance to do just that. But not every sequel is received as warmly as what came before. Take Banjo Tooie, one of the industry's strongest arguments that bigger doesn't always equal better. As the sequel to Rare's genre-defining Banjo Kazooie, Banjo Tooie had a lot to live up to. It feel like I just re-completed Banjo Kazooie, even though it was over 2 years ago at this point. Oh my god, what is time anymore? To me, Banjo Kazooie is a nostalgic masterpiece. It's filled with fun and memorable characters, smart design choices that have had a clear and obvious impact on other 3D platforming games of today, and pitch-perfect sound design. This game also includes definitely my top 3 video game soundtracks ever. And over time, I've had the privilege and the honor to develop a strong friendship with composer Grant Kirkhope, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are really sick of hearing about at this point. And the cherry on top, Nintendo just put Banjo Kazooie on the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack, which is crazy to think about because that game has never gotten a Nintendo re-release. So it really feels like a little bit of a coming home for Banjo. So with that said, what does Banjo Tooie bring to the table? To expect completing Banjo Tooie to be as emotional of an experience as completing Banjo Kazooie would be a bit crazy for me. My initial response to the game was what you might call muted. I made a video about it to be released during what I dubbed at the time the month of sequels segments, and it was my first time ever playing the game. I didn't play the original version, but instead the Xbox Live Arcade re-release, which included achievements and tons of improvements. There was a lot about the game right out the gate that just stuck out to me as sort of odd. I thought the game had a weirdly dark tone that was sort of off-putting. Within seconds of starting, we're seeing the death of Bottles and introduced to a village utterly torn apart. It's such a different tone than the first game that it impacted a lot of how I felt about the whole completion experience. Core gameplay was refreshingly familiar to anyone who still loves 3D platformers. Banjo the Bear and Kazooie the Bird must progress through different themed worlds by finding dozens and dozens of Jiggies, Jinjos, Globos. Do these start to sound a little bit like slurs to anyone else after saying them over and over again over the years? No? Just me? Yeah, okay. It's classic third-person 3D mascot character platforming. I jumped, I flew, I explored every inch of every stage, gathering up collectibles and snatching up every Jiggy I could. My overall takeaway was that Banjo Tooie was massive, but ultimately not that memorable, or at least not as memorable as the first game, which again, an impossible standard to overcome for me personally. The stuff that remains good about Banjo Kazooie is all good here, because for the most part, Tooie takes the old and adds a bit of new. The controls are almost exactly the same, and so is the completion process. There's also a bunch of new stuff, including some structural and mechanical changes, the addition of multiplayer, the connection of all the stop and swap stuff connecting together. At first glance, Banjo Tooie looks like just a basic follow-up, but playing as Banjo and Kazooie separately at times, playing as Mumbo himself, and all the different transformations definitely helps make Banjo Tooie stand out from the shadow of its predecessor, as does the unconventional overworld structure. However, by the time I finished completing the whole game, I found the entire experience to be a bit of an overkill. The game had lots of weird backtracking and gating choices that fundamentally made me unhappy at times, the sheer volume of collectibles, the addition of several multiplayer modes, and a few weirdly difficult side quests had me feeling like this game might be too much of a good thing. Look, that bird racing minigame is just the nightmare fuel that a lot of people have experienced, yours included. I just want balls, motherfucking, I gotta hate that bird. Now, it might sound like I was being a little harsh the first time around, but the fact is, Banjo Tooie was still a lot of fun to play. It maybe got to feel a little too long in the tooth by the end, but I still gave it my then rating of Finna-Peed-It, despite everyone making fun of the fact that it seemed like I did not like this game. But that was then, and as it is so often the case, re-completing this game helped me see this sequel with a new, fresh pair of eyes. And though it still has some stumbles, I found that as I completed it once again, Banjo Tooie is overall a much better game than I gave it credit for. Now, the general consensus around Banjo Tooie seems to be, yes, the game is bigger than what came before it, but even though it has some refinements, it isn't necessarily a better game. It's hard to argue with that sentiment sometimes too. But having a few years of distance from playing this game for the very first time provided for me a little bit of perspective. And honestly, once I stopped directly comparing it to Banjo Kazooie and appreciated the game on its own terms, I had a blast. All right, so right away, I found the visuals of Banjo Tooie to be incredibly impressive. Banjo Tooie was released in the year 2000, and what I like to think was a you to the Y2K panic. The sequel came out only a year and a half after Banjo Kazooie. That's less surprising than it sounds. We're used to game sequels taking years, sometimes even a decade between releases. And even with just a year and a half between the two games, there's a sharpness to the visual fidelity that really stands out. This is evident even in that dark opening cutscene where Gruntilda is resurrected by her horrible sisters, Mingella and Blobelda, after her long-suffering assistant Klungo fails to rescue her. Gruntilda vows revenge on Banjo, Kazooie, and everyone who helped them, and so they murder Bottles the Mole and attempt to raise Spiral Mountain to the ground. Banjo and Kazooie see all of this and are fired up to take down Gruntilda and her sisters once and for all. It's kind of a gnarly opening that asks for a lot of investment from players. Interestingly, Banjo Tooie did not require players to make use of the Nintendo 64 expansion pack, despite it being a much bigger and more beautiful looking game. Rare managed to optimize the hell out of the rapidly aging N64 hardware. Though I'll admit, I didn't play this game on the N64. Again, I completed it on the Xbox Live Arcade. Gotta get those achievements, baby, and that delicious crossover with other Rare Replay titles. Whew. So in my original playthrough, I was very focused on the oddball tone that Banjo Tooie tries to thread the needle on. The writing still has that signature Rare sense of humor with a lot of jokes that will fly over kids' heads nowadays, but still land with older players. It's very dry and very, very British. Though I gotta say, the nostalgia in me really misses Gruntilda's rhyming couplets. But I guess it does make sense why Grunty isn't written that way anymore. After all, she basically died and is brought back to life, so she's through saying cute little rhymes to mock the player characters. Grunty is out for blood in Banjo Tooie. She wants to see the end of Banjo, Kazooie, Mumbo Jumbo, basically anyone who fucked with her in the first game. Except weirdly Tootie, who is almost nowhere to be found outside of a missing poster in Cloud Cuckoo Land. But even though Grunty is hell-bent on taking down our heroes, Banjo and Kazooie aren't going to run away. They too want some damn vengeance, like a bear and bird Batman. This story actually has stakes, which is always good in a sequel. But let's be honest here, we're not usually playing 3D platform collectathons for the plot. I'm here to scour every area for collectibles, and Banjo Tooie delivers that. The game has 9 worlds packed full of 100 musical notes each, 10 Jiggies, 5 Jinjos, 18 Globos, honeycomb pieces, 25 Cheeto pages, and 3 very secret game packs. Every collectible has its place and purpose, and finding 100% of everything on a level is always satisfying. Collectibles and progression feel linked, which is great for completionists. And beyond those collectibles, there are also new skills to master for the duo. All the original moves from the first game are right here at the beginning. Take that, Samus! But there are a ton of new abilities too, and I was surprised by the amount of brand new moves there were to master. Instead of learning moves by finding Bottles, rest in peace, in a level, I had to seek out jam jars and pay him in musical notes, which is great because now the musical notes have real currency in real time as opposed to the very end, or throughout the paywall journey. The new moves are pretty fun, but the most interesting advanced techniques are tied to Banjo Tooie's best feature, the ability to split up the bear and bird duo. This is one of those features that makes perfect sense for a sequel. I just spent hours fully mastering Banjo and Kazooie's movesets in the first game, so what can the sequel do differently? Break up the team and give them little solo missions to do. Now, I found this to be very cool. Players, however, cannot do this on command. There are special pads that players must step on to split up the pair. By themselves, Banjo and Kazooie lose a bunch of versatility, but gain more unique moves as well. Weirdly, and this is something I don't think I talked about the first time through, Kazooie can't really fly by herself. She can only glide, which sort of feels like an oversight. Being able to run around just as Banjo or just Kazooie feels unique. And for being a sequel to a game that built its identity around the mascot being a duo, this mechanic gives Banjo Tooie a stronger identity. And on top of all of that, Mumbo Jumbo himself has some solo sections too. I noticed this time around that they don't feel super fleshed out. The inner child in me thinks it's awesome to run around as this skull-headed magician. I liked that Mumbo had a little bit more to do in this game, but who was going to help with the transformations this time around? The answer would be Humba Wumba, a Native American girl who somehow fits into this crazy fantasy world. It's sort of incongruous to have a human woman just exist here, you know? Even Gruntilda and her sisters don't feel like people, more like monsters. So it was always kind of odd to interact with Humba Wumba, who again is a human woman. But hey, the transformations are awesome. And who doesn't love that washing machine Banjo and Kazooie? Or this little dino baby, that's my favorite one. Banjo Tooie makes some bold choices, some of which I think work and some of which I question. Now, I've mentioned the tonal shift of this game, but it extends to more than just the plot. It's a small thing, but the Jiggies are just objects now. They don't have eyeballs anymore, which stuck out to me for some weird reason. Another change is that players now have infinite lives, so they don't have to seek out golden Banjo statues and try to avoid a game over screen. This is a massive step towards what 3D platforming games look like nowadays, and definitely a welcomed change to the first game. Not that I died a lot, I've got some skills, alright, I'm pretty good at games. But the concept is smart. I always appreciate when developers can look at something they made objectively and make changes to feature things that don't quite work anymore. Now, one of the biggest changes is the actual layout of the map in the game. Banjo Tooie, even though it was released so close to Banjo Kazooie, was way hecking bigger. Development of this game started pretty much immediately after the first game released, and there were a ton of features and areas that didn't quite fit into Banjo Kazooie that got rolled into this game. The world is enormous and all interlocked, you know, like Elden Ring or Dark Souls. Sorry, I've been playing a lot of those games lately. I originally found the bigness of it all to be kind of a drag. I feel like I needed a map, as it's pretty easy to get lost. This time around, I still land on the side that there's a bit too much backtracking for my taste. That's not to say that it's all bad by any means. I understand the design philosophy, and it actually ties back to something that makes perfect sense for this game. Now, in the original N64 Banjo Kazooie, if you did not collect all the musical notes and jinjos in the level in one go, they would reset it if you exited the level. Of course, that changed in the Xbox Live versions for both Kazooie and Tooie. In Tooie, whatever the player finds is recorded because you are much more likely to have to exit the stage to backtrack and find a new skill or something. So it makes sense why there's an emphasis on backtracking in the game. But that doesn't mean it's aged particularly well. In Rare revealed an interview with the developers that went around in 2015, the team acknowledged that the backtracking could possibly have been better implemented, but counted on the relationships between the characters being timeless enough that players wouldn't mind so much. And the devs were almost right. I'm not the biggest fan of the backtracking in Tooie, but I understand why it's here. Despite the backtracking kind of being a drag at times, there are plenty of moments that make up for that particular tedium. I think the bosses in this game make some really strong impressions, and I had to strategize in how to defeat them. Some of the new moves are so intuitive that it's hard to believe they weren't in the original game, like ledge grabbing or the different type of egg ammo. And of course, there's still a great Grant Kirkhope score to keep me smiling throughout it. Again, it doesn't hit me the same way as the original Banjo Kazooie soundtrack does, but the love is definitely still there and the sound design is still top notch. This era of N64 games has some of the best video game music ever made, and Grant composing for Perfect Dark and Donkey Kong 64 at the same time as Banjo Tooie is crazy cool and makes me appreciate all the soundtracks all that much more. One of the big things that still stands out to me, however, in this game is not only the backtracking, but the mini games that are inside it. So one of the big things about Banjo Tooie that really threw me for a whirl originally was all of the FPS sections that were spread throughout the title. There were a lot of them, and it's obvious that the passion of Banjo Tooie was injected into this first-person perspective. However, there were so many of them that I got sick of them, and I still feel that way. Sometimes those moments of being in first person felt really great. Some of them are challenging at times. There's new egg ammo to make it different. Sometimes there's the boss sequence altogether. But the true nature of it is that there's so many of them that I was burnt out. And that burnt out feeling was here again. And in feeling burnt out, I also felt that way with some of the other levels. Some of these level designs are brilliant. They're fun, they're interesting, they're engaging. But the word that I want to describe, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that stuck with me. Every single stage feels long, like really, really, really long. So much so that that's where the backtracking actually bothers me. It's not that I have to backtrack. It's that I had to spend so much time in the stage that the last thing I want to do is to come back to it. It is really cool that all the stages are interlocked, so you can kind of jump around from stage to stage. But in the end, I never wanted to revisit any of these stages. And to cap it all off, the mini games in this game just overall felt a little bland. Bland's not the word I want to use because they are interesting at first. Maybe the word I'm looking for is repetitive and exhausting. I felt a lot of that sentiment in Donkey Kong 64 and I felt it pretty strongly, but it's not nearly as bad with Banjo Tooie. Getting back on track here, it's easy to dunk on a sequel that isn't as memorable as its predecessor, but honestly, I had a lot more fun with Banjo Tooie this time around. And of course, streaming on Twitch always makes it more fun, but seeing the passion of my community play this game with me was really exciting. But I think a lot of that enjoyment comes from the fact that since this game came out, I have played a lot of new 3D polished platformers. Even though I've completed and enjoyed the spiritual yet divisive successor that is Yooka-Laylee, or more modern games like Psychonauts 2, there is a lot to appreciate in Banjo Tooie. It was a bit of a shock to play this game and be surprised when something I thought was a modern convention showed up here. Sometimes the concept of New Game Plus, this show where I am committed to re-completing through all these games that started my completionist journey to here, makes me feel weighed down. I sometimes feel like there's an expectation to deliver those same jokes and tone as my first videos, or sometimes deliberately avoid them altogether. Sometimes there were things that I legitimately missed for completion, and I can use these new videos to rectify that. But with re-completing Banjo Tooie, it felt like an opportunity to relax and enjoy something that I knew I would like, even if it doesn't carry the nostalgia of the first game. But what Banjo Tooie lacks in warm fuzzy feelings for me, it makes up for with secrets and even a couple of actual completion bonuses. Banjo Tooie continues the tradition of rewarding players who make an effort to find everything. And in the Xbox Live arcade version of this game, which I did again, there are plenty of bonuses to be enjoyed for completionists. The end of Banjo Tooie forces Banjo and Kazooie into a quiz battle show with Gruntilda's sisters. And this quiz show is actually significantly easier for completionists, as all the questions relate to specific trivia within the game. And even though this game is pretty massive, much like the trivia game in Banjo Kazooie, players will benefit from having absorbed this game in a short amount of time. If you really immerse yourself in Banjo Tooie and make it to the end in a short time period, you'll probably have a much easier time with these quiz questions. Sadly, there is nothing to unlock by playing the multiplayer side of things. These modes are fun and interesting and weird, but you can definitely tell they were a last-minute add-on to Banjo Tooie. And honestly, it was such an afterthought that I didn't even record footage of it because, well, COVID. They almost feel like a test for the multiplayer in Conker's Bad Fur Day, which certainly feels much more refined. As far as the actual completion collectibles go, the bonuses are pretty fun here. Earning all 90 Jiggies unlocks a character parade, where you can see all the character models. And there's a bonus cutscene in the credits for those who found 100% of every item in the game. But there are also a couple of secret exclusives to the Xbox Live Arcade version. We even got a little crossover with Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, where some unlockables in this game transferred over to the game and vice versa. Of course, we've all heard this, but in case, for those of you who don't know, back in the day, N64 players who had copies of Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie would be able to collect and find certain collectibles in one game, like the mysterious ice key, turn off their console, pop in the other cartridge, and that data would theoretically carry over into the new game that was just inserted. This was called Stop and Swap. But unfortunately, the technology didn't quite work as intended, and the feature was thought to be an unsolvable mystery. However, through the magic of digital assets, Stop and Swap was revived in the Xbox Live Arcade versions of both of these rare games. So, if you've got data on your Xbox for the original Banjo Kazooie and Nuts and Bolts, you got access to a few secret items. I was able to unlock a new multiplayer character, a Jinjo, as well as some homing eggs to fire at enemies. The coolest reward is certainly Dragon Kazooie. If you find the ice key in Banjo Kazooie, it is added to the Stop and Swap items in Tooie. I can then take that ice key to unlock a vault with a Mega Globo. Taking the Mega Globo to Humbawamba transforms Kazooie into a Dragon Breagle, where she can breathe fire when standing still. It also has unlimited fire eggs to shoot. It's fun, silly, overpowered, and it is the perfect secret bonus for players who take their time to find the ice key in Banjo Kazooie. The Stop and Swap stuff is cool, but part of that is because it didn't require me to do any of the crazy backtracking that is present in Banjo Tooie. It's more of a secret than a completion bonus. The actual in-game bonuses, the character parade, an extra cutscene in the credits are fun, but don't feel essential to me. As much as I loved completing games in this genre, Banjo Tooie might not be compelling enough on its own to complete. In my re-completing of Banjo Tooie, there were 45 Jinjos saved, 90 Jiggies collected, 25 missing pages for 5 cheat codes, 25 extra honeycomb pieces in order to earn 5 extra health honeycombs, 24 move upgrades from Jam Jar, with the 25th being an extra bubble upgrade from the Goldfish, 18 Globos including the Mega Globo, 6 Stop and Swap eggs, 7 Stop and Swap 2 achievements, 13 bosses defeated, 12 Xbox Live achievements earned, and a deep sadness in my stomach knowing that we'll never get Banjo 3E. Although I believe someday we will. Gotta believe.
I think in the end, Banjo Tooie was a lot more fun to complete than I remember it being at the time. Though it's tough to avoid making direct comparisons to one of my favorite games of all time, there is a lot to love about Banjo Tooie on its own merits. If you're a fan of the genre, it's a very worthy successor and follow-up. But this game suffers a little bit from being slightly too much of a good thing. Play through to the end, but don't feel like you have to stick around and completely get 100% of everything done. So, with that in mind, I give Banjo Tooie my new completionist rating of finish it.
Finish it!